Hello everyone, welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online general psychology course, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in lifespan developmental psychology. Now, each kind of one of these, even slides really, are basically entire chapters in a developmental psychology course that I also teach. So if you find yourself interested in some of these topics, I would highly recommend you enrolling in my developmental psychology course. All right, so with that said, let's jump into it. Beginning with a definition. What is developmental psychology? The field of study that deals with the behavior, thoughts, and emotions of individuals as they go through various parts of the lifespan. It is easily said the study of change. There are several challenges that arise when examining human development. So as stated, it's the study of how and why we become who we are. And some scholars actually argue, developmental psychologists argue, that you can really put developmental as, or conceptualize it really as a perspective. So you can think of developmental cognitive science, developmental personality psychology, just because really, as stated, kind of development being the study of change and how we become who we are. So you can kind of take that lens to really any field of psychology and possibly other fields of social scientists as well. Before we get in there, let's clarify the nature-nurture debate. Nurture is defined as our genetic endowment. This is kind of like your biology, things that people say are like innate, for example, things that you're just born with and you can't change, kind of that typical framing, which is not entirely accurate, but that's what people say. Nurture, environments we encounter. Both play a large role in shaping development. Now, in psychology, nature and nurture is not viewed as an either-or issue. Rather, nature and nurture work together to influence developmental outcomes in psychologies. For example, gene-environment interaction. This can be defined as the effects of genes depend on what kind of environment we experience. How we respond to the environment depends on what genes we have. So, for example, MAO, which is an enzyme, doesn't really matter what the specific is, and it's thought to be linked with antisocial behavior. That is, low levels of MAO enzyme is linked to higher levels of antisocial behavior. Researchers have discovered that whether this genetic risk factor is associated with violent behavior depends on whether children were exposed to specific environmental factors. Children with both the low MAO gene and a history of maltreatment, such as physical abuse, were at heightened risk for antisocial behaviors like stealing and assault. So kind of the idea here is that genes are not this determinative practice, but rather predispositions, risk factors for certain developmental outcomes. So rather saying, oh, I have this gene, therefore I'm going to be, mean, I'm going to steal, I'm going to be violent. What researchers suggest, and specifically through this gene-environment interaction kind of model, is that genes that act as risk factors, again, in this case here, kind of this MAO enzyme, wherein if you have kind of a certain gene, you're sorry, I should say low amounts of this gene that produces this enzyme that placing you at risk again for assault or antisocial behavior more generally. However, it's not, again, determinative. Just because you have or have low amounts of that gene does not mean you're going to be violent, but rather if as you are developing throughout your lifespan you encounter harsh adverse environments such as experiencing physical abuse, violence in your home, well, what happens is that kind of combination of environmental influences, that physical abuse that you experience, plus that predisposition, that risk factor, specifically that low amount of MAO gene, come together to increase the risk of stealing and assault. So rather the gene alone being responsible for that increased risk of antisocial behaviors, it's the combination of a child having that genetic predisposition and living in and developing in environments that are adverse and specifically being exposed to violence, for example. So this is an example of how genes and environments work together. This brings us to something called epigenetics. Environmental factors affect whether or not particular genes in particular cells are expressed and might explain differences in identical twins. The activation or deactivation of genes by the environment experiences throughout development. Predispositions are not automatically activated. It's like a light switch. So kind of the idea here is what the environment does. So for example, say you're born with a genetic predisposition, a risk for whatever gene, just make up a gene in your head, the violent gene, which does not exist, but whatever. Say I'm born with the violent gene. How it works is, as stated, the violent gene does not mean I'm going to be born, that I'm going to ultimately partake in violent behaviors, but rather the environment, again, that I'm exposed to has an impact on the expression of that gene. And the easiest way to conceptualize genetic expression is like a light switch. So turning it on or off. So activating that gene or deactivating that gene. So what makes the light switch turn on and off? Well, it's your environment. So exposure to, again, violence, poverty, racism, etc., just hardship throughout your life will make it more likely that that gene is activated. So that's literally the environment activating that, quote unquote, the violent gene, thus increasing your likelihood of a person engaging in violent behaviors as an adult or adolescent or as a child. But if that same child with that same genetic predisposition, that same violent gene that they're born with, grows up in an environment that's supportive, that has ample educational opportunities, that is safe, free from extreme adversity, that gene is never activated. Instead, the light switch is instead turned off. And thus that person is no more likely than any other average person. That is, I should say, that person with the violent gene is no more likely to engage in violence than a person born without that violent gene, because their environment deactivated or never activated the violent gene. So again, environments interacting with your biology, your genetics, in dynamic ways. Now let's talk about specific research designs for developmental psychology, or at least their application. It's not specific just for developmental psychology, but rather how these specific research designs are applied to developmental psychology. Beginning with cross-sectional design. The cross-sectional design studies examine people of different ages at the same time. So you can imagine a study that has groups of participants, a 10-year-old, a 15-year-old, a 40-year-old, a 60-year-old, and say that they're administered a mathematics quiz. And then we say, okay, the 60-year-olds did really bad on the mathematics quiz that they took online. Therefore, older adults are shit at math. And the 15-year-olds did really well. Therefore, 15-year-olds are the best age, or those at that stage in their development, at that middle teenage years or those early teenage years. That's when you're best at mathematics. However, there are some limitations to this kind of design in the interpretation of those results that I just laid out. Specifically, cohort effects. Sets of people who lived during one period may differ from sets of period who lived during a different period. Exposure, tech, worldwide events. So, for example, say we're again kind of collecting data on a 2-year-old, 7-year-old, 20-year-old, 40-year-old, 80-year-old, okay? And we're measuring how well they search and kind of navigate the internet or use apps, whatever, using something technologically related online. And then we see the older adults are performing, so therefore we conclude, okay, the older adults perform very poorly on this kind of tech test, navigating the internet, navigating apps, whatever. Therefore, older adults therefore my conclusion is, okay, once you hit 80 years old, you suck at technology, you can't perform technology, you don't know what's going on. However, this is where cohort effects come into play. So, for how this works out is that, imagine an 80-year-old. They did not grow up with the internet, the computers, smartphones, laptops, Wi-Fi, etc. So they have far less experience than, say, a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 20-year-old who grew up with those technological advances. So then the question is, are you actually measuring some kind of innate, quote-unquote, innate ability of older adults, tech use or proficiency in tech use, or are you actually measuring a cohort effect wherein people of a certain generation never interacted with those devices because they literally were not invented yet? So trying to disentangle kind of the history of groups' development from their environment, the things that they experience in their life, and then comparing it to other generations is very difficult because generations and different age groups are exposed to literally different technologies, different worldwide stressors that may impact their interpretation of the world or their skills. So you can even say their personal behaviors or beliefs on something may be influenced by something that they experienced that future cohorts did not experience. This is compared to longitudinal designs, which track the development of the same group of participants over time. Development effects, changes over time within individuals, divorce, loss of job, new child, attrition. Okay, so basically we have here for longitudinal designs, instead of kind of cross-sectional designs, look at, again, kind of different ages of people. It doesn't have to be different ages of people. It can actually all be the same age, but this is kind of the example I'm working with here. So the point for cross-sectional is that they look at it only one time. You collect that data one time, you compare whatever it is you want to compare, and then you're done. Those people are gone, you never interact with them again. Versus longitudinal, you collect your participants, but they don't disappear once you finish your experiment. Rather, you measure the same group of participants multiple times throughout their lifespan. So going back to mathematic quiz, say, for example, we administer a mathematic or math quiz. I don't know why I keep saying mathematic. Math quiz to 15-year-olds. Instead of just saying, okay, you're done, we'll never see you again, we're going to administer that same math quiz at 17, 18, 19, 20, and for who knows how long. And then what we're going to do is we're going to see how they improve or get worse at math throughout their entire lifespan, which basically then you can kind of interpret as, you know, those increases and decreases of mathematical abilities as changes over time within an individual. Basically trying to get at, okay, is there kind of a consistent universal trajectory of math development that we can track by following the same person for years on years and then seeing if their skills increase, decrease, what ages they increase and decrease, and then kind of try and draw general conclusions based on that. So we're tracking change within a individual. Versus cross-sectional designs, we're comparing between individuals and only one time. Now, some challenges for longitudinal designs. Obviously, throughout your life, big things happen to you. You may get a divorce, loss of a job. You may have a child. And those kind of big life-changing events, and sometimes maybe something crazy will happen and you hit the lottery or something. So these kind of big life-changing events that sometimes are kind of rare impact a person's developmental trajectory. Thus, which then begs the question, how generalizable, how applicable are a person's developmental trajectory to everybody else? Because a person may experience wild and kind of crazy things. But not only that, in longitudinal studies, the more you ask participants come back to your experiment, you may start off with 100 participants, for example, but over time, 10, 20, 30 years, less and less people are going to come back to your experiment. That is called attrition. And in general, the people who are most at risk are most disadvantaged, the disabled individuals, poor individuals, racial minorities. They're less likely to come back or continue to come back to your experiment. Thus, you may be your sample may become increasingly biased because basically you're filtering out participants who are exposed to the most hardship in their life. Now, that doesn't make any of these two designs bad. It just, all research has limitations, and it's something you just have to keep in mind as kind of you're reading something. It doesn't make the results like invalid or bad or whatever, but, everything, as stated, has limitations. Let's talk about some common misinterpretations of developmental psychology, specifically the post hoc fallacy. It's a logical error where you assume that A causes B just because B comes after A. So, for example, all serial killers drink milk as babies, so milk causes people to be serial killers. So see what I mean here? So just because something comes before an outcome, so just because A comes before B, does not mean A caused B. There's a million things that happen throughout an individual's life that may have caused B. It's not A, B, it's A and, whatever. It's further than Z, whatever comes after Z, So in the case of the serial killer example, it's not that the reason they became a serial killer is not because they had milk, but rather whatever, X, Y, Z, elemental P, reasons why, or that contributed to that developmental outcome. Bidirectional influences. Developmental effects commonly thought of as unidirectional in pop psychology. Human development is almost always a two-way street. Humans actively create/change their environments. They create changes in their family, peers, workplaces, countries, cultures. Children's development influences their experiences, but their experiences also influence their development, such as parent-child interactions. So kind of the idea here, and kind of pop psych in general, and kind of, just kind of common understandings of psychology is that, okay, this one thing happened, therefore this, to an individual, therefore this other thing happens. So again, A happens, and then eventually B outcome happens. So it's unidirectional. One thing happens to a person, and then there's some outcome. But that's not how developmental psychology works. There are thousands of things we experience constantly. And typically, it's not unidirectional, again, that one way A to B. But and the easiest way to think about this, for example, is parent-child interactions. So yes, parenting can affect and does affect children's outcomes. However, children's kind of behaviors, the way they act, their temperaments, things we'll talk about later on in this lecture, also affect parenting styles and parenting practices and the parents' mental health, for example. So it's not this just one-way direction, but rather, again, kind of this two-way street wherein parents and child are kind of interacting with each other to influence both of their developmental outcomes. But another example is not only that, but interacting with your family, peers, workplaces, as stated. So yes, we're influenced by all those. We are developmentally impacted by those factors, those environmental factors, family, peers, workplaces. But also, we can change our peers. We change our families' kind of viewpoints on the world change. We can change our workplaces. Our workplaces can also change. Jobs leave, their job cuts, their unionizations, jobs move. All these things can happen, which kind of just speaks to to kind of human capacity to create and change their environment. It's not this one-way street, this unilateral direction, this unidirectional impact of development, which is again kind of conveyed in popular psychology, like media kind of thing. Which brings us to a man named Bronfenbrenner. He argued that scientists were studying human development out of context. Development can vary widely depending on neighborhood, the home environment, culture. He charged that developmental psychology has become the study of, quote, the strange behavior of children in strange situations with strange adults for the briefest periods of time. People are embedded in a series of environmental systems which interact with each other and the individual over time to influence development. Changes arise from ongoing transactions in which a changing organism and a changing environment affect one another. So basically what Bronfenbrenner is arguing is that the environment that we live in, our cultures, our countries, our historical era we grow up in, impact our development. So it's, yes, there are universal developmental trajectories, all things that we all go through on a biological level. However, there are also variations in developmental outcomes depending, again, on these historical eras, our cultures, our families, our workplaces. And it's not only those kind of those environmental factors impacting us, but it's also us impacting our those environmental factors. So we can change our culture, we can change our country's laws, we can change our friends. But let's make this a little more concrete in the next slide. He proposed the bioecological model, or sometimes called the ecological systems theory. How the environment is organized and how it affects development. The developing person is embedded in a series of 4 environmental systems, sometimes 5, It's and they and just look at here. I'm not going to read all these, but look on the right hand side here. Look at all these things that can impact development. So kind of generally in the US, we really only focus on kind of like your family, your household, but it's not just your family and household. So many other things impact your psychology. So for example, your job, your neighborhood, your school, the media, your country's laws, your culture, your class. Are you poor? Are you rich? And what historical era you live in? So basically what Bronfenbrenner is arguing is those environmental factors, family, friends, neighborhoods, schools, laws, belong in certain levels of, or I should say, can be categorized in specific levels or systems. And those are the systems seen here: microsystem, mesosystem, exosystem, etc. With the microsystem kind of being the traditional way, again, that is taught in the US. Psychology is a very individual and family-oriented, just immediate family member-oriented study. So, but Bronfenbrenner is saying, yes, that is true. Family does impact you. However, it's not just family, and specifically the microsystem, but rather these other larger systems that impact you. And in the developmental psychology course, I walk through, I spend a majority of my time kind of outside the microsystem because, again, it's very kind of biased in the West, really focusing on that microsystem. But all these other systems impact people. In individuals' developments, in groups' developments, developmental outcomes, I should say. He argued, and by he I mean Bronfenbrenner argued, that development will be complex because outcomes depend on many factors. Will a parent losing a job be detrimental to a child? Maybe. Historical period is important. The relationship between environments and people change over time. Disenchanted with comparing children at different SES levels, SES meaning socioeconomic status, it's kind of a bad measure, but that's what psychologists use. It's kind of class-oriented. PPT model, process, person, context, time. Over the course of evolution and during individuals' development, genes and environment influence one another and co-act to decrease the probability of developmental outcomes. So going back to kind of parent losing a job, does that impact a child's development? And the answer is maybe, because it depends on, for example, the historical era you live in. Do you live in the 1800s, where if you lose your job, aka you lose your farming job, and you're probably going to starve to death? Well, probably going to be detrimental to a child. Or are you an older adult who loses their job? So you're 80 years old, you lose your job in 1900. Well, you're in deep trouble because Social Security did not exist. However, in 1970, you're 80 years old and you lose your job. You say, oh, wait, at least I have Social Security. I have this pension now because like labor unionization happened. So therefore, I'm more financially secure. And therefore, I'm not going to be specifically impacted as much by that job loss. But you can also say that for a child. So I'm 40 years old, I have a child, and I lose my job. Well, does it impact the child? Well, do I exist in an era where unemployment insurance exists? Do I exist in an era where there's COVID? So all these kind of these historical factors, and again, those macro factors, and what I mean by macros, those economic policies, those political policies, those political philosophies impact developmental trajectories. So again, it's not just microsystems impacting people, but also those macro systems impacting a parent, impacting the child, and also going back the other way, child and parents impacting those macro systems. So again, not just households, but rather your entire environment impacting people. And basically what he's arguing is, and how development should be understood, is that based on the amount of risk and adversity you grow up with, alongside kind of how much kind of support you get in your environment. Again, not just from your family, having supportive family, like supportive parents, but for example, again, something like Social Security increases or decreases the probability of developmental outcomes. Again, it's not something happens and then you turn out to be something else. Or sorry, a stressor happens in your environment and then you develop a specific 100% of the time you develop a specific way, but rather it increases or decreases the probability of developmental psychological outcomes occurring. So think in terms of all these environmental factors impacting you in different ways, and then all those kind of factors contributing to the probability of you becoming a certain person, which again can change through time. So some of the strengths and weaknesses: conceptualizes development as the product of a dynamic interactions between biological and environmental forces. Its studies demonstrate, that traumatic events can disrupt multiple systems. It considers the role of historical context in development. Limitations: generalization problems. It depends, maybe. Do all developmental outcomes have the same degree of maybe? How do we measure this? So kind of the idea here is that one of the strengths is that we measure the impact of all these environmental outcomes. We can understand through specific examples that historical context matter to development. We can also understand that certain big events, such as COVID, for example, COVID impacted economic policy, political policy. It impacted people's jobs. It impacted stress of a parent. So you get big stressors, big traumatic events can impact multiple levels, multiple environmental factors that influence developmental outcomes in a child, a parent, or a group of people. But there are challenges to that. A study cannot measure every environmental factor. It's literally impossible. So then the question is, how do we design research to kind of keep the spirit of Bronfenbrenner alive, but understanding that it's literally impossible to measure all these things? And that can be challenging. Okay, now that we have some theory out of the way, let's talk about prenatal development. Some researchers argue the most dramatic developmental changes occur during early prenatal development. A zygote is formed when a sperm cell fertilizes an egg. After this, there are 3 stages of development occur. A zygote divides over and over again to form a blastocyst. During the germinal stage, blastocyst is a ball of identical cells early in pregnancy without any specific function yet. In the middle of the 2nd week, cells begin to assume different functions, and the blastocyst becomes an embryo. An embryo, 2nd to 8th week of prenatal development, limbs, facial features, and organs form. The embryonic stage lasts about 8 weeks. By the 9th week, in the start of the fetal stage, the major organs are established and the heart beats. The fetus continues physical maturation and, quote, bulking up until birth. Obstacles to prenatal development: teratogens, environmental factors that can exert a negative impact on prenatal development. Smoking, drinking, chickenpox. Alcohol consumption can lead to fetal alcohol syndrome. Genetic disruption can reflect disorders or random errors in cell division. Prematurity. Being born prior to 36 weeks can result in numerous problems. Premature birth, low birth weight. The less time in utero, the greater chance of serious complications. So, as stated before, environmental factors impact the probability of certain developmental outcomes occurring throughout the life and throughout the lifespan. But also, environmental factors impact prenatal development. So literally prenatal outcomes. And this is most easily understood through smoking, drugs, but also exposure to chickenpox, for example. All these, and I should add as well, prenatal stress. So just extreme stress. Being exposed to a hurricane can increase prenatal stress and contribute to prenatal developmental outcomes such as low birth weight. And low birth weight, children who are born low birth weight are kind of associated, or at risk, I should say, for other negative developmental outcomes. So maybe slower developmental outcomes or early death. And the most severe impacts are seen in children who really don't have kind of proper follow-up nutrition and support. So kind of low birth weight babies born in poor areas who are going to have poor mothers, poor fathers, poor families, thus have kind of less medical technology available to them, less nutrition available to them, and kind of more stress throughout their lives. Next, I want to talk about something called ACEs, adverse life events. All types of abuse, neglect, and other potentially traumatic experiences that occur before the age of 18 are referred to as adverse childhood experiences. They're associated with, well, everything. When a child experiences strong, frequent, and or prolonged adversity without adequate adult support, the child's stress response systems can be activated and disrupt the development of the brain and other organ systems. ACEs increase the risk for stress-related disease and cognitive impairment throughout the lifespan. So basically what ACEs are, and what researchers do, is they administer kind of this questionnaire, and they ask you, were you experienced physical abuse? Were you, did you grow up poor? Was your house very always noisy, etc., etc.? Kind of like traumatic stressors. And what the researchers do then is kind of just add up all those stressors together. They then give you a number. And then what they do is so say we're an experiment, we do this, I give you an ACEs questionnaire. Again, you complete that questionnaire. You then, all your stressors are then added together. And what they do is they test a correlation between that number, the number of stressors you experience, that number of adverse child events that you experience, and whatever developmental outcome they're associated with, that they're measuring, that they're interested in. So that could be self-esteem, academic achievements, rates of incarceration, quality of marital relationship. Did you go to college? Did you pass high school? Are you addicted to drugs? Do you vote? Whatever. So you can so what researchers do again is add up that number of total adverse child events, and then they perform statistical analysis to see if there's a correlation between ACEs and whatever outcome that they're interested in. So let's show some examples here. Look at the name of this study: Homelessness in Childhood and Adverse Child Experiences. So what they found was that among the 250 respondents who reported homelessness in childhood, 68% reported experiencing 4 or more ACEs. In contrast, only 16% of respondents who reported no homelessness in childhood reported experiencing 4 or more ACEs. So what they found here basically is that children who are exposed to homelessness are more likely to experience adverse child experiences. And again, the more ACEs you have, this has been linked with depression, anxiety, all kinds of mental health outcomes, shorter lifespan, all kinds of negative developmental outcomes. And this is just one example here. And here's another study looking more of a biological level. And basically what they looked at here is ACEs and the association between ACEs and kind of early childhood and depressive symptoms across later life adolescence. So the more ACEs, the more depressive symptoms, positive correlation. So just again speaking to the impact of ACEs. And I talk about that in far more detail in developmental psychology course. Next, I want to briefly talk about physical growth before we kind of jump into cognitive development. So adolescence, a transitional period between childhood and adulthood, commonly associated with the teenage years. This is when our bodies reach full maturity, in part due to hormonal release. Ovaries and testes secrete testosterone and androgen, and estrogen, progesterone, which stimulate the growth of, or the production of growth hormones. Attainment of puberty, that is sexual maturity, is largely due to hormonal release. The achievement of sexual maturation resulting in the potential to reproduce. There causes changes in primary and secondary sex characteristics. Primary sex characteristics are defined as physical features of reproductive organs. Secondary sex characteristics are referred to as sex differentiation that doesn't directly relate to reproduction, such as breast enlargement in girls, deepening voices in boys, and pubic hair in both genders. Menarche and Spermarche. Menarche is defined as the first menstruation between ages 11 and 15, and Spermarche is defined as boys' first ejaculation around age 13. So basically all we have here is sex hormones influencing the development and kind of the sexual maturation of an adolescent, and the primary sex characteristics are primary and secondary sex characteristics as defined in the slide. Genetics and environment influence the timing of puberty. Wealthier countries tend to begin menstruation earlier than poorer countries. The age of menarche has decreased over the past 100 years. In 1940, the average age of menarche was about 16 and a half years old, a full 4 years later than it is today. Americans are taller today. 5'7" average male height in 1900 and 5'10" today, while females, the average height was about 5'3" in 1900 and about 5'4" today. It's thought to be this is thought to be associated with better nutrition, healthcare, and hormones in food. So kind of straightforward here, but really just an example again of like, yes, we do have these biological processes. Puberty happens, it's universal, but you can see differences across the developmental context and again across historical eras. So comparing height and puberty in the 1900 versus this is today, but really this is a study from like 2017, something along those lines, but it hasn't changed much. You can see the differences in height and sexual maturation depending on the historical era and what content and what developmental context you're developing in. So areas with better nutrition and healthcare are going to contribute to the likelihood of a child growing taller, because as we kind of commonly understand, nutrition is very important to development, physical growth. Like eat your vegetables, kids, all that good stuff. Physical development in adults. Most of us reach our physical peaks in our early 20s. Strength, coordination, speed of cognitive processing, and physical flexibility. Declines begin shortly after in muscle tone, sensory processes, and fertility. However, age-related decreases vary. Declines may not be related to aging itself, but diseases that are correlated with age. Environment effects impact age-related declines, such as physical activity. So kind of the idea here, again, is we do have kind of an understanding of some universal decline, but the extent to that decline is highly debated. It used to be thought that, okay, yes, this is just a universal decline, you hit a certain age and you're screwed. But now there's a much more deeper understanding of this trajectory, wherein things like physical activity and mental activity contribute to individuals kind of maintaining mental and physical performance throughout their lifespan. So it's not this kind of universal decline, but rather influenced by kind of your daily activities, or again, kind of access to healthcare, for example, being able to treat diseases, medical advances, again, the historical era you lived in. And not only that, but there are also gains in kind of mental ability throughout the lifespan. But again, that's for a different class. All right, so let's talk about cognitive development across the lifespan now. There are numerous explanations of how we acquire the ability to learn, think, communicate, and remember over time. They differ in three main ways: stage-like versus continuous changes in understanding, sudden spurts in knowledge followed by stability versus gradual increases, domain general versus domain specific accounts, changes affect most versus all areas of cognitive function in tandem, versus cognitive skills develop independently and at different rates across different domains, such as language and reasoning. And principal source of learning: physical experiences, such as moving in the world, versus social interactions, such as engaging with parental figures, versus biological maturation, innate programming of cognitive abilities. All right, so let's break this down a little bit. Stage-like versus continuous change. So we have kind of two competing theories here. So what stage-like theorists argue is that, and the easiest way to conceptualize this, is kind of like a stair. So at each step of the stair that you're walking up, you unlock new abilities that you previously didn't have at this other stair that you were standing on. So it's kind of this sudden spurt of new abilities that you unlock with each step up those stairs, versus a gradual increase, which is like, okay, it's not this kind of stair process wherein you have to walk up each stair in a specific order, and each stair unlocks a whole new set of abilities, none of which you had prior to being on that new stair, but rather a kind of gradual increase, kind of like going uphill. And throughout that process of going uphill, you're slowly accumulating kind of various abilities, various skills throughout development. So even though you can be kind of low on that hill, not very far up that hill of development, that metaphorical hill, you could still have some abilities of math, for example. There's not just like this magical math stair that you reach and then you unlock like all X amount of math abilities, but rather you kind of have a general understanding of math, and it's slowly you're building on that as you go, in a cumulative fashion. So kind of again, stairs, or like a video game, like you you hit a new level and you level up your character and you unlock all kinds of new abilities, versus you're kind of just grinding and building on sets of abilities as you go. Domain general versus domain specific. Domain general is typically staged like theorists argue this, because domain general is arguing basically that you develop, when you develop, everything gets better. So at each stage, at each stair, at each level, you unlock your entire kind of range of developmental outcomes increase in ability. So all your cognitive abilities increase together at each stage that you, at each stair that you increase. So that's why it's general. So it's everything. It's increasing, unlocking new abilities at each stairs, versus domain specific, wherein the cognitive skills that you're developing are developing independently. So, for example, you could be really good at reading, for example, or have some. You could be better at reading at 3 years old than you are at math. There's different, basically, developmental trajectories for different specific cognitive abilities. They're not all developing at the same rate. You don't reach a certain stair and then all of a sudden everything is unlocked. You've increased your reading, your math, your social skills, your physical maturation skills, everything is kind of increased. But rather, again, specific skills develop at specific, independently of each other, and they do so kind of gradually. So you can see the difference here. Domain general kind of being linked with stage-like. And then the principal source of learning. So do you learn by moving in the world, kind of more interacting with the world, kind of independently, in general is how they frame this, versus social interaction. So a mentor, for example, your parents, your extended family, your tribe, your community, your clan, whatever. Those kind of mature figures, those elder respected figures, through social interacting with them, you kind of learning about the world, versus, again, kind of independently exploring, moving in the world in your own physical experiences, versus biological maturation. So this is basically just like, hey, you hit 4 years old, you unlock new ability, 5-year-old, you get this new ability. So it's, again, innate, universal process for, that's what biological maturation means. So kind of those are all of those things are just some of the kind of areas of debate. And you can see in the theories that we're about to talk about how those components that are debated influence these developmental psychologists. Beginning with Piaget. Now, Piaget, if you're classic theorist, it's always taught. If you were taught, for many years, this dude had developmental psychology on lock. He was the primary guy taught. He influenced so much thinking. I think he's kind of way oversaturated, and he does not hold the same influence that he did, 40 years ago, but still very influential in the United States. Piaget's theory. So we're going to walk through some of his arguments. He argued that intelligence is a basic life function that helps an organism adapt to its environment. It reflects its background in biology. Piaget viewed infants as active agents in their own development. Stage theorists who believe skills are domain general thought the endpoint of cognitive development is ability to reason logically about hypotheticals. So he's a stage theorist. So at each stage you unlock new abilities. The skills are domain general. So when you reach a new stage, you would unlock all kinds of abilities across all domains of your cognitive functioning. And again, infants are active agents. They're working independently. They're operating in the physical world, and that's how they're learning. Piaget argued that children use assimilation to acquire new knowledge within a stage, absorbing new experience into our current understandings. Worldviews remain unchanged. A conflicting new information is reinterpreted to fit in with what is already known, Earth flat. When one can no longer assimilate new information, accommodation forces change between stages, altering a belief to make it more compatible with experience, accept a new way of looking at the world. So basically what Piaget is arguing here is that children and throughout development, you have a specific worldview. And that worldview, when you have that worldview, and kind of you're also interacting with the world around you. And you're taking in new experiences, running into new information. And when you run into new information, you have two options: assimilation or accommodation. Assimilation means that you absorb your new experiences into your current understanding of the world. But that understanding of the world does not change. Okay, so basically, what you do is you see information about the world around you, and you and say it conflicts with your worldview. Well, what you do if you're assimilating, you just kind of warp that information. You interpret that new information to make it fit within your already preconceived worldview. Versus accommodation, what you do is, again, you have a certain worldview, you're interacting with the world, you now run into an experience, some bit of information or social experience that challenges your worldview. If you're going to accommodate, what you do is you alter your worldview belief, basically. That new information has now influenced you, and you're changing the way that you look at the world. So literally, again, so this kind of speaks to working kind of almost like as an individual. You're acting within the physical world, you're counting in information, and you're choosing to shift your worldview or kind of shift the information in front of you and not changing your worldview. So for example, say a child believes the earth is flat. The child may assimilate the new knowledge by picturing a flat disk, like a coin. However, a child confronting with a globe will have a difficult time assimilating this information into her conception of the earth as flat. When the child's existing beliefs can no longer assimilate new information, they undergo accommodation to more accurately reflect the new information. So, if, say, a child believes that the earth is flat, they then see a globe, and they're like, no, the globe is wrong for whatever reason. I know for a fact the world is flat. That is an example of assimilation versus saying, oh, wait, that is indeed the globe. The world is not flat. Then they're kind of engaging in accommodation. They have now updated their view of the world based on that information. And while this is going on, they're kind of practicing these cognitive skills going on internally based on kind of this stage of development they're at. They have certain skills that allows them to kind of weigh the validity of information presented to them. Which brings us to the stages of Piaget. And each stage in Piaget's development have specific, or I should say children at each stage of Piaget's developmental theory have specific ways of looking at the world and certain cognitive limitations associated with the stage of development that they're at. So the let's begin with some of these stages. The sensor motor stage, I should say, birth to 2 years old. Piaget argued that there's no thought beyond the immediate physical experiences. Information is acquired through observing physical consequences and of their actions in the here and now. They lack object permanence, major milestone in mental representation, ability to think about things that are absent from immediate surroundings, remembering previously encountered objects. Symbolically imagine things that cannot be seen, they are now able to understand object permanence. So basically the idea here of object permanence is I show you a ball, or like a 1-year-old a ball, they understand that I have a ball in my hand. I then put a blanket over the ball, and if they do not have object permanence, the child is like, this ball is gone. The ball no longer exists. It's outside reality. It's gone. But the idea here is once they develop object permanences, now the child can kind of symbolically understand that although they cannot see the object still exists in kind of, the physical world. Pre-operational stage, about 2 to 7 years old, marked by an ability to construct mental representations of experience. They can pick up a banana, for example, pretend it's a phone, even though they have no physical experience with calling on a banana. Symbolic behavior, symbols to represent ideas. They're hampered by egocentrism. So here again, you can see the stage. They've now unlocked new abilities. They now can have this, they can have mental representations of experiences. They can engage in symbolic behavior. So literally, this banana is a phone. This piece of paper is a pancake, something along those lines. Even though they've never seen a piece of paper be a pancake before, they now can look at those objects and have them represent something else. However, Piaget argued that they're hampered by egocentrism. Basically, all that means is that what they see right in front of them is basically all of reality. They cannot take perspectives of other people. They are super egocentric. And you can see here it's kind of the influence of Piaget, or what may have influenced Piaget. This is a very individualist kind of understanding of cognitive development. It doesn't really consider a lot of culture, and again, framing individuals as very egocentric, kind of self-absorbed people, which again, this is kind of like very a Western-oriented kind of form of development. You can see kind of Piaget's own cultural influence here. And we'll just skip to the formal operational stage, 11 to adulthood. Children can, or I guess really kind of almost teenagers, can understand hypothetical reasoning beyond the here and now, posited as the most sophisticated type of thinking. They also understand logical concepts and abstract thinking questions such as if-then. So, for example, if I'm late for school, then I'll get sent to the principal's office. So now Piaget is arguing that now, at this stage, they've unlocked new abilities. They can abstractly reason about things. They understand like cause and effect and if and then statements, and they can do this mentally and then understand kind of the consequences of kind of doing these actions in the real world. Pros and cons, Piaget's theories, just some. Development is more continuous than stage-like, researchers argue now. It probably underestimates children's competence, often relied on children to report their own reasoning process. Other scholars have found that milestones develop quicker, so as you can see, certain ages that Piaget suspects that things develop, or in certain orders. Researchers around the world have found that the ages are often incorrect, and children will develop certain abilities before Piaget, in an order in which that Piaget would say is impossible. So they would develop skills kind of out of order of the stages. Also culturally biased methods. Culturally sensitive non-Western interviews reveal more sophisticated insights. So basically the idea here is that some of the measures that Piaget used to measure these insights of children may not be culturally applicable to other people across the world. Still highly influential and help change how we think about cognitive development. Kids are different from adults. They are not just kind of baby or smaller adults. And learning is active, not passive. Moving on to Vygotsky's sociocultural perspective. He was born in Belarus, same year as Piaget, and developed his own comprehensive theory of human development. However, he is taught far less than Piaget, even though he was a hugely influential psychologist outside of the US. Some kind of typical excuses have been why it's not taught as much as that he didn't speak English, so it's hard to translate. Well, it's really not applicable at 2022. We have translators, but also Vygotsky did die far earlier. Piaget lived long, while Vygotsky died early in his life. Vygotsky argued that culture and society play a pivotal role. Intelligence is held by the group. Education doesn't just teach facts; it shapes how we think about the world generally. Formal operational thought is rarely used in some cultures, for example. He expected a cognitive development to vary from society to society. It depends on the mental tools that the culture values and makes available. Children acquire mental tools by interacting with parents and other more experienced members of their culture. So kind of as stated, Vygotsky really argued he's not a stage theorist. He's kind of a gradual, continuous theorist of development. And again, the culture and society play a role in development. And specifically, elders, respected members of the community, teach children, and that's how they develop cognitively. And again, it's not just facts, but it's ways to think about the world. How do you conceptualize the world? What is your problem-solving process? Literally, how are you organizing information in your head? Those kind of tools, those mental tools, are culturally based. He also argued for kind of four concepts here, beginning with scaffolding, which is a learning mechanism in which parents provide initial assistance in children's learning, but gradually remove the structure as children become more competent. So, as stated another way, parents structure environments for learning and then gradually remove the structure. It's borrowed from building construction. So kind of when you're in construction, you provide external scaffolds while building is under construction, and then you slowly move it away as the building becomes more stable. It's kind of like training wheels on a bicycle. So you're teaching a child to ride a bicycle, you have training wheels on it, and then as they improve, you kind of take off their training wheels, and now they have that ability. zone of proximal development, the gap between what a learner can accomplish independently and what he or she can accomplish with the guidance and encouragement of a more skilled partner. Skills within the zone are skills at which instruction should be aimed. Skills outside the zone are either well mastered or still too difficult. So scaffolding, kind of as stated, is kind of this initial structure of learning environment. And as a child learns, gets better at something, you kind of remove assistance and kind of allow them to independently, but still acting. It's not independent. You know, you have supervision. You're interacting with kind of your mentor, your parent, your peer, who's more skilled than you, and can give you guidance. You kind of create that structure, and as they get better at it, you kind of give them a little less supervision, or a little less direct supervision, direct advice, allowing them to work within a controlled environment, but with kind of adequate supervision to make sure they're learning things that are culturally appropriate to the group or the family or the clan or tribe, whatever, the neighborhood. So like training wheels, as stated, just kind of giving assistance and slowly kind of dwindling it down, so eventually they can be a contributing member of the family, the neighborhood, the country, the tribe, etc. And how Vygotsky conceptualized this, and really kind of work from Vygotsky influenced these other theorists as well, but it's fine. We're going to lump them in with Vygotsky for purpose of this class. This zone of proximal development. So kind of the idea is that what can a child learn independently versus what can a child learn with a more skilled partner, providing them with encouragement and guidance. And that gap in between is the zone of proximal development. So again, the gap between what you learn independently versus the on one end of the spectrum versus learning with a mentor, an advisor, a skilled partner, peer. Now, skills within that zone between those two kind of poles, those two ends of the spectrum, Vygotsky argued, are the skills which instruction should be aimed at. Why is that? Because skills outside that zone, so say it's I give you a task, for example, or something that's too easy. Rewind. So skills that are either too hard or too easy should not be focused on. So why is that? So say something's really easy. So imagine you're 13 years old, and I'm like, all right, well, I'm going to super scaffold you. I'm going to teach you how to do 1 + 1, 2 + 2, 3 + 3. Well, you're just wasting that person's time. They're not actually learning anything. It's outside of that zone of proximal thought because it's so easy that they've already mastered it. Versus, for example, say I'm working with a 6-year-old, and they're learning basic math, and I'm like, all right, now I want you to perform complex statistics. Go, baby, let's go. I'm gonna give you some mentorship, but I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna help you do this. I'm gonna make you understand complex statistics, trigonometry, whatever. It doesn't matter how great of a mentor I am. A child does not have. They're not at that point in their development wherein they can actually learn that information. It's simply too hard for a 6-year-old to learn calculus. So thus, don't target those skills. You have to kind of build up the prerequisite skills to be able to eventually have calculus be within that zone of proximal development. Vygotsky argued that children can acquire skills and master tasks at different rates. It's not this universal stage-like thing, but rather, again, you acquire skills and master tasks at different rates depending on your scaffolding, the things that a cultural or historical era values. There are no domain general stages. Children internalizing the problem-solving techniques that are discovered through collaboration, eventually being able to use the techniques on their own. So by working collectively with respected elders, people of knowledge, within a family, tribe, whatever, neighborhood, school, in a collaborative fashion, children then internalize those problem-solving techniques, which then they can then go and use on their own and kind of contribute to the larger collective. Some implications of its theory: knowledge is not a fixed state, but rather something that develops, that grows through mentoring, through elders, through collaborating with experts or knowledgeable people. There is no single test or score can adequately reflect the range of a person's knowledge. A meta-analysis found that each year of schooling adds 1 to 5 additional IQ points. It demonstrates that the concept of intelligence is wrapped up in particular kinds of cognitive skills acquired through cultural learning. So kind of as stated previously in other chapters, psychometric approach to testing measures specific types of thinking strategies, specific cognitive skills, so kind of hypotheticals, and that's representative, and kind of going back to my own personal anecdote, not being familiar with that specific cognitive strategy, that specific way of being tested. Once I took a prep course on the quiz, all of a sudden, or on the standardized test, my scores all of a sudden increased gigantically. Well, I didn't get any smarter within a 2-month period. I just learned that specific cognitive skill to take that test. Development, Vygotsky argues, consists of moving toward the upper range of your zone of proximal development, and you can even conceptualize it that maybe, and this is kind of debated, but each kind of skill or having kind of zones of their own proximal development. This is kind of abstractly stated. So you can be good at one thing and not as good at something else. All right, moving on to social development. Infants develop interests in other people very quickly after birth. We are mammals, of course. Stranger anxiety starts at 8 to 9 months and peaks at 12 to 15 months. Differences in children's social and emotional styles reflect differences in temperament. Temperament can be defined as the tendency to respond in predictable ways, such as sociability and emotional reactivity, that serve as the building blocks of later personalities. And these appear very early on. There are 3 proposed major styles of temperament. Easy, about 40% of children are adaptable and relaxed. Difficult, about 10%. Fussy and easily frustrated. Slow to warm up, 15%. Disturbed by new stimuli at first, but gradually adjust to them. 35% don't fit neatly into any category. Approximately 10% of children may be behaviorally inhibited, frightened at the sight of novel or unexpected stimuli like faces, tones, moving bodies. Hearts pound, bodies tense up. So kind of the idea here is that this temperament serves, as stated, as later building blocks of personality, and you have these 3 styles, with easy, kind of being straightforward, easy, child's relaxed or adaptable. Difficult, fussy, very easily frustrated when presented with challenges. And then slow to warm up, you can conceptualize as someone kind of being hesitant at first, but as you kind of get used to a party, or maybe used to being around your extended family, you kind of warm up to it and you adjust to the circumstance. So it's kind of a build-up. It's slow to warm up. So you're eventually warm up. The child becomes a little easygoing, adaptable, easy, more like an easygoing child. But it's kind of a steady building up process that occurs. It doesn't take forever, but within what I'm just making up something, 5, 10, an hour, whatever it is, it takes the child to warm up to new people that they're interacting with. Attachment theory. It's based primarily on ethology, the study of the behavior of various species in their natural environments and the evolution of that behavior. It asks how attachment might have helped our ancestors adapt to their environment. Attachment is defined as a strong affectional tie that binds a person to an intimate companion, a behavioral system through which humans regulate their emotional distress when under threat and achieve security by seeking proximity to another person. For most babies, the first attachment is a parent at 6 to 7 months of age. Throughout our life, objects of attachment are special, irreplaceable people to whom we want to be close to and from whom we derive a sense of security. So kind of the point here is that attachment allows a child to regulate their behavior. So they're working, they're developing, they're interacting with a world that everything is new, and they're overwhelmed at times. They're stressed out. One way kind of to deal with this stress is to lean on an attachment figure, typically their parents, but you can be attached to other individuals as well, like a grandparent, for example. And what this attachment allows is that kind of a co-regulation of stress. So they can lean, emotionally speaking, psychologically speaking, lean on their attachment figure to help them decrease their emotional distress, their stress levels, and by seeking security, by being physically and emotionally close to that person. So before a child is able to independently to the extent that, quote unquote, we can independently regulate stress, could do so, or at least are less capable of doing so. They depend on this attachment figure to help them kind of navigate the world and deal with those stressors. Now, I should say again that we're not going to talk about in this lecture, and it's not tested on, but attachment figures exist throughout your lifespan. It's not just as children, but kind of the first ones appear at about 6 to 7 months of age. Now, attachments do not form automatically. A responsive social environment is critical. An infant's pre-programmed signals to other people may eventually wane if caregivers are unresponsive to them. Infants construct expectations about relationships via internal working models. They are cognitive representatives of themselves and other people. They guide processing of social information and behavior in relationships. Studies suggest securely attached infants will develop secure internal working models that they are lovable. Insecurely attached develop models that they are difficult to love. So kind of the idea here is that we have this biological need to be attached to someone as a child. We're overwhelmed on a biological level about the world around us. We need someone to help co-regulate that stress, have a sense of security with us. However, if our environment is not responsive to those needs, a child are likely to be that attachment will not be automatic, and a child may not form a secure, a high quality attachment to anyone. So basically they're on their own and they're left trying to navigate that stressful world by themselves. It's also argued that through that relationship, that attachment, a child will kind of conceptualize all future relationships based on that attachment. So based on my attachment with mom, dad, grandparent, whatever, that's my expectation for myself and others, and how I expect relationships to be into the future. And there are specific types of attachment, which we'll discuss momentarily, that are associated with more positive outcomes. Now, in general, those outcomes have traditionally been studied in kind of U.S. samples and in kind of like basically high income or really professionally developed, like families with bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, children. In those studies, they have found something called secure attachment kind of being most related to the best developmental outcomes possible. So if a child is securely attached to their attachment figure, then they're more likely to develop optimally and have kind of the best developmental outcomes. Now, this is challenged based on kind of new cultural findings, such as some people being raised by not just an immediate family, but kind of like a kind of quote unquote, it takes a tribe to raise a child kind of thing. So extended family members, all these other things. So maybe, it's not the parent attachment that's as influential. Maybe it's these other family relationships, or maybe it's something else in the environment. Maybe these larger community attachments or something along those lines. So it's debated, but this is kind of the traditional way of seeing these things. Also, again, not tested. We also form later attachments throughout adolescence to other people that may be at least as influential to developmental outcomes. But again, these are kind of the broad strokes. We're in a general psychology class, but so this is kind of the old school general expectations. So there are 4 types of attachment styles between a parent and a child. There's secure, resistant, avoidance, and disorganized, disoriented attachment. I'm not going to read all this, but secure attachment, an individual welcomes close contacts, uses the attachment object as a source of comfort, versus resistant attachment is sometimes also called insecure attachment, wherein a child will have strong separation anxiety and a tendency to show ambivalent reactions to the attachment object, aka their parent. Avoidant attachment, literally kind of straightforward here. Little separation anxiety and a tendency to avoid or ignore their attachment figure. Disorganized or insecure attached caregiver bond, wherein it's kind of just chaos. There's all kinds of different things. Sometimes there's anxiety disorder. Sometimes they don't care if their caregiver is in their presence or not. They're often kind of almost dazed and confused, about if they should approach their caregiver or avoid their caregiver. And the idea here, again, is that these attachment styles are thought to impact a children's conceptualization of future relationships and predict later life developmental outcomes. Parenting styles. Authoritarian, and there are four, kind of thought to be four parenting styles. This is actually not correct, but again, we're not going to deep dive into this in this general psychology class, but this is kind of the traditional parenting styles that you'll run into and see in the world. There are actually different parenting styles that exist in the world that aren't covered here, and these four types of parenting styles are not found across the entire world. Again, lecture's long enough, so let's keep it basic to get our general understanding before we get into specific in future courses. More specifics in future courses. Authoritarian parenting is defined as a restrictive parenting style combining high demand control and low acceptance responsiveness. Authoritarian parents impose many rules, expect strict obedience, rarely explain why the child should comply with rules, and rely on power assertion tactics. Authoritative parenting is defined as flexible, demanding and exert control, but are sensitive to their children. They set clear rules and are consistently enforce them, but have rationale for the rules. They explain them to the children and are responsive to children's needs, points of views. So authoritarian, high demand, high control, but low responsiveness to the child. So basically, I have my rules, listen to them, shut up. Those are the rules. I don't need to explain myself to you. Authoritarian parenting has rules that are consistent, but are more open to dialogue with the child. So kind of explaining why the rules exist and being responsive to a child's needs to some extent. Obviously, it depends on their age. Permissive parenting, indulgent, it could also be described as indulgent parenting, are high in acceptance, responsiveness, but low in demand. It's just a child-centered approach to parenting. There's relatively few rules, and parents make relatively few demands. They rarely exert control over their child's behaviors, and they encourage their children to express their impulses. Neglectful parenting, also called disengaged or uninvolved parenting, is a low demandedness, control, and low acceptance responsiveness. They're hostile and rejecting or indifferent, overwhelmed by their own problems, cannot devote energy to expressing love and enforcing rules. So permissive or indulgent, kind of straightforward here, child-centered. There's very little rules. Kind of the goal of the parent is to just make the child happy. They don't exert control over their child. There's not consistent rules. They encourage children to express themselves, and they make few demands on the child. So basically, a very high amount of acceptance, but very low kind of control and demandingness. Neglectfulness, low demanding and low acceptance. This is generally kind of just unevolved or just being just extremely hostile, with fluctuations between hostility and uninvolvement. Typically, parents who have this parenting style are overwhelmed with their own life. They have either a disorder going on in their life or just extreme amount of stress and hardship going on in their life, contributing to kind of their disengagement or kind of hostility. Cultural and historical periods matter when considering the impact of parenting styles. Argued styles not matter as much as once thought, as long as an average expectable environment is provided. Environment that provides children with basic needs for affection and discipline is aka good enough. Abusive parenting, toxic effects may matter the most. Matter most if they are toxic parenting or a child is genetically predisposed to antisocial behavior, for example. So kind of the big main takeaway points here, bringing this down a little bit. Historical and cultural periods matter. So, for example, authoritarian parenting, high demand, little explanation for rules. Imagine, for example, you're crossing a street and the child's like, "Oh, I want to run across the street. I don't care." Well, at that moment, it's like, "Hey, shut up. I don't want you to get hit by a car. Like, I need you to just listen. I don't have time for this rules." But you can imagine this in a more extreme scenario. So, say a child grows up in a war zone, or a very poor neighborhood, or a violent neighborhood. And the parent, to kind of adapt to that neighborhood, is like, okay, listen, here are the rules. You're not breaking these rules, and I'm in control. We're not doing this like give and take thing. Because in that environment, that may be most appropriate for the survival of their child. So something that can seem harsh can actually be beneficial to the child, depending on the historical moment, in the cultural and environmental circumstances. Some have, in fact, argued that it really doesn't matter these individual styles, but rather just give a general good enough approach. Provide affection with some level of discipline, But at the end of the day, just don't be insanely abusive to someone, that kind of extreme toxic abuse, physical, psychological, sexual abuse is harmful, but kind of everything else in between, it's kind of, it's good enough. And they also argue that really what matters is, again, avoiding those kind of extreme toxic behaviors. But if a child, again, going back to that predisposition, if a child is predisposed to certain behavior, a genetic risk for something, then maybe the parenting could be more impactful, because you want the environment to kind of optimally fit with the child to make sure that they don't experience like extreme hardship and thus kind of activate those genetic predispositions. Again, this is all kind of, these genetic predisposition things are kind of abstract, there's no single gene for any behavior. What it exactly means and the probability of something occurs is really not precise. There's a lot of information we need to still learn about genes. But basically, these are some of the critiques and things to keep in mind for parenting style. Other issues with parenting, the impact of same-sex parents on development is clear. There's no difference from opposite-sex couples in social adjustment, academics, or sexual orientation in their children. Most children come out of divorce without long-term emotional damage. Effects depend on severity of conflict before divorce. The higher the conflict, the better the outcome. And by higher, I mean lower, and I'm not going to re-record that. So it's the lower the conflict, the better the outcome, obviously. The less conflict within that divorce period, the better the child outcome would be expected to be. Let's move on to life transitions in adulthood. Careers and job satisfaction are connected to emotional well-being. Positive feelings at work spill over into family satisfaction and work-family balance. Spillover is defined as the extent that events in one domain influence the other. Love and commitment. Vast majority of people become part of a long-term relationship at some point in their life. The average age of marriage has increased in the U.S. Parenthood. New parents who have the easiest time adjusting to parenthood have the most realistic expectations about the amount of change in expectations. So kind of the idea here with the spillover effect is we have a kind of a general understanding of this, right? You have a bad day at work, and then you're stressed out, and then all of a sudden, the classic cliche, you come home and kick the dog because you're mad at what happened to your work. Or more generally, maybe you have a rocky relationship or a negative interaction with your spouse or your child or your extended family, because there's a spillover effect. We're not a different person when we're at that can compartmentalize stress from work to home, but rather we're one person, and we bring the impact of our environments with us to new environments. So stressors we encounter in other environments come with us to new environments, and vice versa. So say you have a great marriage, or you have a horrible marriage, and then you come to work, and then you feel horrible, and then you perform worse at work, and then maybe your boss yells at you, and then now you have more stress. And so you can see that's what it means by spillover. So again, kind of going back to Bronfenbrenner's theory, is that we work in all these different levels of development, and all these different levels of development, and those environmental factors within those levels of development, or those systems of development impact us all in a kind of a transactional way. And the parenting point, basically, kind of straightforward again. Kind of the idea here is that parents who have an understanding that, yes, parenting is going to be stressful and not this magical, rainbow time, generally have the easiest time adjusting to parenthood because they have appropriate expectations. Versus, like, say I have a rocky relationship and I'm like, okay, I'm going to go have a kid and now my relationship will be great. Well, it's probably not going to be great, and those warped expectations are going to make things even worse. And wrap it up with life transitions in adulthood, social transitions in later years. Chronological age is not a good predictor of measuring the impact of changes in later life. Instead, psychologists consider others that may be more indicative. There's something called biological age, which is the estimate of age in terms of biological functioning, such as organs, systems, lungs. The body is 40 years old. Psychological age, a person's mental attitudes and capability to deal with stress in changing environments. Some people display little changes in memory and personality with age. And social age, whether people behave in accord with the social behaviors appropriate for their age. Dress your age, for example, a sport car. So biological age is kind of what we should typically just call age. And that's like, my body feels X years old. It's your how well your lungs are functioning. How does your back feel? Do you have that bad ankle? Were you a smoker and your lungs are now messed up? Versus psychological age, so your mental attitudes and capability to deal with stress in a changing environments. So kind of like, you're 30 years old, you have to pay your rent, you have to balance your everyday life, you have to make sure to remember to pay your phone bill, make sure to pick up your kid at school or wherever they are. So kind of just your capability of changing in dealing with stressors and challenges within your environment. And then social age, basically we have kind of in societies, and this varies by culture, certain expectations of social behaviors for someone's age. So this is a quote unquote, at your age kind of thing. So for example, a 60-year-old guy maybe going through, or maybe even a 45-year-old guy going through like a midlife crisis, and he's like, yeah, I'm gonna get like a big old sports car, and I'm gonna look young and cool, and I'm gonna like speed and do car races or something. And it's like, okay, well, we have a kind of expectation now that you're almost 50 years old, you're not gonna perform or act in the kind of these irresponsible driving ways. So it's kind of like a social expectation of behaviors, again, appropriate for their age as defined by a culture. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. Again, if you found any of this interesting, I would highly recommend you enrolling in my developmental psychology class, where we'll talk about these and many other aspects of development across cultures, across historical eras, and across class, race dynamics, LGBT issues. So with that said, thank you so much. Bye.